The wedding should have been the most joyful day of our lives, a day filled with love, celebration, and family. My son, the groom, had waited so long for this moment, and we had all come together to witness his happiness. The air was filled with excitement, the soft clinking of glasses, the sound of laughter, and the hum of music as guests mingled. Everything seemed perfect, just as it should be. But in the middle of the celebration, something happened. Something that shattered our world in an instant and turned the evening from a beautiful occasion into a nightmare. It wasn't the cake, the flowers, or even the wedding speeches. It was one single, unexpected moment that would haunt us forever. My daughter, Grace, sitting peacefully in her wheelchair, was about to become the target of something far darker than I could have ever anticipated. I remember looking around, seeing my son smiling as he danced with his new bride. I should have been enjoying the moment, proud and content, watching my family come together to celebrate such a special day. But instead, my thoughts were consumed by Grace. She was sitting by my side, her wheelchair tucked neatly beside the table, a place where she could comfortably watch the festivities unfold. Grace wasn't asking for attention. She wasn't drawing any extra attention to herself. She was simply there, enjoying the moment as best as she could. But the second Karen walked into the room, I could feel the tension building. She wasn't even looking at us at first, but I could tell she was surveying the room with her usual critical eye. She was the HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of our neighborhood's perfect image. She was always watching, always judging. Her gaze swept over the room, but it was when her eyes landed on Grace that everything changed. Grace, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing, was just smiling at some of the guests she recognized. She had no idea that Karen had already sized her up, judged her presence, and deemed her as something wrong. It wasn't just the wheelchair. No, it was more than that. It was the fact that Grace didn't fit into Karen's perfectly curated world. She didn't conform to the expectations of beauty, strength, or normalcy that Karen believed should be present at every event. She was a reminder of everything Karen hated: imperfection, vulnerability, and weakness. To Karen, Grace was a disruption, a blemish on an otherwise pristine celebration. And for that, she felt the need to act. There was something unsettling in the air when Karen made her way toward us, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, echoing like a countdown to disaster. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As she drew closer, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple, uncomfortable interaction. She wasn't here to compliment the bride or to exchange pleasantries. No, Karen had a different agenda, one that was fueled by her obsession with maintaining control and perfection. I had witnessed her make cruel, snide remarks in the past, remarks aimed at people who didn't fit her ideal image of the neighborhood. But I never imagined she would go this far. As Karen approached, I saw the venom in her eyes, the deep-seated hatred that radiated from her. The hostility was palpable. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten as I saw her approach Grace, her gaze now locked on my daughter like a hawk eyeing its prey. Karen opened her mouth, and the words she spoke were sharp and cold. This is no place for someone like her. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the room seemed to go quiet. I had never seen Karen so enraged. I tried to defend my daughter, tried to stand up for her, but Karen wasn't listening. The words she spewed were filled with judgment, disdain, and cruelty. She made it clear that Grace's mere presence was a threat to the wedding, a threat to the perfection that Karen believed should be present at every event. She doesn't belong here, Karen sneered, but that wasn't enough for her. No, Karen wasn't satisfied with just verbal cruelty. The moment she looked at Grace, I knew something was about to happen, something I couldn't prevent, something I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. What happened next is something I'll never forget. It was the sound of a gunshot that split through the air, loud and unforgiving. It echoed in my mind, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The world seemed to slow down in that instant as I watched in horror, powerless, as Karen pulled out a gun and aimed it directly at my daughter. "This ends tonight," she screamed, the violence in her voice unmistakable. My daughter, innocent and vulnerable, was sitting in her wheelchair, completely unaware of the danger she was about to face. In that moment, I couldn't understand why Karen had gone this far, why she had chosen to target Grace. What had she done to deserve this? It wasn't just a gunshot that rang out in that room. It was the sound of our lives unraveling. Everything we knew about kindness, compassion, and decency was shattered in that one moment. And as I rushed to my daughter's side, as I screamed for help and tried to make sense of what had just occurred, one question kept running through my mind. Why did Karen do it? Why target a helpless girl in a wheelchair, someone who had never harmed her, someone who was just trying to live her life? Let me take you through the events of that night, a night that started with joy and celebration but ended in pain, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. A night that changed everything for my family and for Grace. This is the story of how one woman's hatred and obsession led to a tragedy that no one could have ever predicted. It's a story of pain, loss, and the lengths some people will go to in order to maintain their twisted version of perfection. Every story has its protagonists, the ones we root for, the ones whose lives we follow with anticipation and empathy. Then there are the antagonists, whose actions stir the very emotions we wish to suppress, forcing us to confront the ugliest sides of human nature. In this story, there are two sides: the family that I love deeply, and a woman whose hatred drove her to unspeakable actions. The protagonist, me. The mother, I am the mother in this story. Like many mothers, I've always been fiercely protective of my children, especially my daughter, Grace. There's nothing I wouldn't do to ensure her safety and happiness, even when life throws the most challenging obstacles in our path. Grace was born with a disability, a condition that made her reliant on a wheelchair for mobility, but it never stopped her from living her life to the fullest. She had a spirit that could light up even the darkest room. From the day she was born, I promised myself I would never let her feel any less than anyone else. I encouraged her to pursue her dreams, to love herself just as she was, and to never let the world's judgments define her. I've spent my life fighting for her dignity, her rights, and her right to exist freely in a world that often fails to understand her. As her mother, I had always known that she would face discrimination, rejection, and cruelty, but I never expected that her greatest adversary would be someone so close to our lives. I never imagined that the woman who was supposed to be part of our community, part of our lives, would become the source of the greatest pain we'd ever experience. Grace, the heart of the story, Grace, my daughter, is the heart of this story. She is not just the victim of this crime, but a symbol of resilience, love, and strength. She has always been kind-hearted, compassionate, and optimistic despite the challenges she faces daily. For her, the wheelchair was never a limitation. It was simply a tool that allowed her to navigate the world, not something that defined her. Grace has a laugh that can brighten any room, a smile that melts even the coldest hearts. She is the light in our family, and watching her grow up into a confident young woman has been the greatest joy of my life. But Grace's world was not without its struggles. There were moments, countless moments, when people looked at her differently because of her disability. People would stare, make harsh comments, and sometimes outright ignore her. Yet, Grace never let it break her spirit. Instead, she used those moments as fuel to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else. When she rolled into a room, people often felt uncomfortable, unsure of how to treat her. But Grace didn't care. She didn't need their validation. All she wanted was to be seen for who she was: a daughter, a sister, a friend, a person with dreams and hopes, just like everyone else. And yet that very spirit, that very confidence, would become the thing that led to her downfall. To Karen, Grace's wheelchair represented something she couldn't control, something that didn't fit into her perfect, structured world. To Karen, Grace was a threat. HOA Karen. The antagonist Karen was the embodiment of everything I had always feared: someone who thrived on control, perfection, and conformity. She was the president of our HOA, a position that gave her the power to dictate the rules of our neighborhood. She ran her household with an iron fist, enforcing rules to the letter, and she expected everyone else to do the same. Karen lived by a set of standards that made it clear anything less than perfect was unacceptable. In her world, appearances were everything. Her house was always pristine, her yard impeccably manicured, and her life, well, it was supposed to be flawless. But beneath that facade of perfection, Karen harbored a deep-seated hatred. Hatred for anything she perceived as imperfect. I had known Karen for years. She was the type of person who made others feel uncomfortable just by being in the same room. She never hesitated to make judgmental comments about people she deemed out of place. Whether it was about someone's appearance, their lifestyle, or, in Grace's case, their disability, Karen was quick to voice her disapproval. She often spoke of how things just didn't belong in the neighborhood, that there were certain standards to uphold if you wanted to be accepted in her world. I had always avoided conflict with her, choosing to keep the peace for the sake of my family. But I knew there was something sinister about Karen, something I had never fully understood until that fateful evening. The night of my son's wedding, when the world was supposed to be filled with joy, Karen's deep-rooted obsession with perfection would come to a head. The moment she saw Grace, her eyes filled with disgust and contempt. I knew she saw Grace's presence as a direct threat to everything she stood for. Grace's very existence, her wheelchair, her way of being, was an affront to Karen's view of the world. Karen had always prided herself on keeping things in order, and Grace was an element she couldn't control. And that, I now realize, is what drove her to act in such an unforgivable manner. Then there's my son, the groom. His name is groom's name, and this night was supposed to be the culmination of his dreams. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life, and the wedding was meant to be a celebration of that hard work, of the love he and his bride shared. But instead, my son was thrust into a nightmare that no one could have prepared for. I watched him that night as he greeted guests, smiled with his new wife, and tried to enjoy what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. But there was something in his eyes, something that showed he was keenly aware of the undercurrents of tension swirling around us. He had grown up in a family where love was unconditional, and he had never understood why people like Karen existed, people who saw differences as flaws, not the beauty they truly were. He had always supported his sister, always had her back, but that night I could see the pain in his face as he realized the truth. The world he thought he knew, the one he thought was safe, was far more hostile than he could have imagined. The story of what happened that night would shape him forever, just as it shaped the rest of us. The wedding day began like any other, a whirlwind of preparations, laughter, and fleeting moments of calm before the storm. The venue was beautifully adorned, a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers casting soft light over the faces of friends and family. There were smiles everywhere, chatter in the air, and an overwhelming sense of joy as we all gathered to celebrate my son's big day. It was a day that should have been a fairy tale, a memory to cherish forever. But from the moment we entered the venue, something in the air told me that things wouldn't unfold as expected. There was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle discomfort that I couldn't quite place, but I felt it deep in my gut. We entered the ballroom, and I immediately noticed the small groups of people chatting, the wedding party moving about with excitement. But there, standing at the far end, was Karen. Her posture was stiff, as if she had come to survey the scene. She wasn't mingling with the guests, offering congratulations, or even acknowledging the bride. No, Karen was watching us, her eyes scanning the room as though she was making mental notes, ticking off names on a list. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, Karen was a control freak, always making sure things were in order, always judging how others live their lives. But there was something different in her gaze this time, something colder, more calculating. Grace, who had been looking forward to the wedding with such excitement, rolled into the room, oblivious to the weight of Karen's gaze. She smiled at the guests she recognized, her eyes bright with joy. But to me, it felt like time had slowed down. The look on Karen's face was unmistakable. It wasn't just dislike, it was disgust. She didn't see my daughter as a person. She saw a blemish on the evening's perfection, an imperfection in her view of how things should be. I knew then, with a sinking feeling, that Karen wasn't going to let it go. She wouldn't just ignore Grace, she would make sure that Grace, and by extension our family, felt unwelcome. I tried to push the feeling down, telling myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, we were here to celebrate, and nothing, not even Karen's unpleasantness, could take away from that. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the music, it wasn't the decorations, it was Karen. I watched her move through the room, eyes flicking back to Grace every few minutes. It was like a game to her, sizing up the people around her, making mental notes of who belonged and who didn't. And Grace, in her wheelchair, was a glaring symbol of everything Karen despised. Someone who couldn't conform, someone who couldn't fit into her narrow view of what the world should look like. The moment came unexpectedly. I had been talking to a guest, my attention diverted for just a moment, when I heard it, a sharp, shrill voice cutting through the laughter and music. It was Karen, standing near the entrance to the ballroom. Her face twisted in contempt. "You need to leave," she said, loud enough for several people nearby to hear. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward her, confusion and disbelief clouding my mind. Karen was talking to me, but her eyes were fixed on Grace. "This isn't a place for people like her," she added, her voice dripping with disdain. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. Maybe I was hearing things wrong. But no, the venom in her voice was unmistakable. Grace, still unaware of the drama unfolding, smiled at the guest in front of her, not understanding the weight of the words Karen had just thrown at us. I stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. It was as though the room had gone silent, all eyes on us. Karen's words hung in the air like a noxious cloud, suffocating everything around us. "Karen, what are you talking about?" I said, my voice shaking, though I tried to remain calm. "This is a wedding, not a place for your judgment." My words fell flat as Karen took a step closer, her face hardening into something colder, more malicious. But she wasn't done. "She's ruining the atmosphere," Karen said, her voice rising. "Your daughter, sitting there in that wheelchair, is a distraction. It's disgusting to have her here." The words stung like a slap, and I could feel my heart breaking. Grace, my sweet girl, was the one who was being judged, her worth questioned by someone who saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of imperfection. But it wasn't just about Grace's wheelchair. It was about Karen's need for control, her obsession with maintaining an image of perfection. Grace, who had done nothing but exist in the world with grace and dignity, was being punished simply for being different. I tried to fight back the tears, to hold my ground, but Karen wasn't finished. "I don't know why you think you can bring her here. She doesn't belong in this space. She's not one of us," Karen said, her voice dripping with venom. It was clear that she had made up her mind. No reasoning would work. My stomach churned, and I could feel my body trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so cruel, so cold-hearted, to attack an innocent child like that? This wasn't just about Grace. It was about Karen's need to exert power, to dictate who belonged and who didn't. The room had gone eerily silent, and I could feel the eyes of the guests on us. But in that moment, I didn't care about what anyone else thought. My focus was solely on Grace. She had no idea what was happening, no idea that she was being targeted for simply being herself. My daughter, the one person who had never done anything to deserve hate, was now the object of someone's twisted vendetta. "Mom," Grace finally looked up, confused, her innocent eyes searching mine. She had no idea what had just transpired. But the damage had been done. Karen had made her mark, and I knew that the evening would never be the same again. I reached out to Grace, trying to comfort her, but Karen wasn't done. She was determined to make her point. And as the tension in the air grew thicker, I realized that this was no longer just a wedding. It was the beginning of something much darker, something I couldn't control. As I looked at Grace, I knew this was just the beginning of a nightmare we never could have imagined. The day that was meant to be a celebration of love had been tainted forever. The woman who had tried to tear our family apart, who had tried to destroy my daughter's spirit, wasn't going to stop at cruel words. No, Karen had far more sinister plans in mind. The tension that had been building all night finally reached its breaking point. As the moments passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't just going to leave us alone with her hateful words. There was something deeper, something darker in her eyes that made me realize we were dealing with someone who was capable of far more than just verbal cruelty. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body tense with fear and anger. I wanted to protect Grace, to shield her from this attack, but I could already sense that whatever was coming next, I wasn't going to be able to stop it. My worst fears were about to be realized. Karen wasn't finished with us. No, she wasn't just going to shame us with her words. I saw her hands move to her purse, slow and deliberate, like she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I froze, unable to process what was happening. My eyes locked on her as she pulled out something metallic from the bag, something that shimmered ominously under the harsh lighting of the ballroom. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she was holding: a gun. I felt the ground beneath me shift, my vision narrowing as panic set in. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. But there it was, right in front of me. Karen, the woman who had always terrorized us with her petty rules and regulations, had now escalated to something far more dangerous. She was holding a gun aimed directly at my daughter, my sweet, innocent Grace, who had never done a thing to deserve this kind of hate. I opened my mouth to shout, to warn someone, but Karen's voice cut through the air like a blade. "This ends tonight," she snarled, her eyes wild with fury. The words were followed by a sickening, deafening sound, the crack of the gunshot. I could barely process the sound before everything around me seemed to blur. My mind couldn't make sense of what was happening. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, unable to move, unable to breathe. Grace. My heart ached as I looked at my daughter, who had been sitting there, unaware of the impending danger, her body now crumpling forward in her wheelchair. I rushed toward her, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and erratic. The pain in my chest was overwhelming, but all I could think about was Grace. Was she okay? Was she alive? The room had erupted into chaos. People screamed, some rushing to call the police, others frozen in shock. But all I could focus on was Grace, her body slumped in the chair, her face twisted in confusion and pain. I knelt beside her, tears streaming down my face as I tried to process what had just happened. She hadn't seen it coming. None of us had. We had come here to celebrate, to enjoy a moment of joy, and now we were caught in the middle of a nightmare. "Grace, sweetheart, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling as I cradled her in my arms. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just a soft, broken gasp. The blood that stained her shirt was the only indication that something was terribly wrong. She had been shot. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My daughter had been shot by Karen, the woman who had once been our neighbor, our community member. I couldn't process it. I couldn't understand it. How could anyone do this? How could Karen, who had once been just another member of our neighborhood, someone I'd had casual conversations with, become a monster capable of this kind of violence? My hands shook as I pressed them to Grace's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but the pain in my chest was unbearable. I couldn't protect her from this. I couldn't stop it from happening. In the midst of the chaos, I saw Karen standing there, her face expressionless, as though nothing had just transpired. It was as if she had committed the act without a second thought, without any remorse or hesitation. The coldness in her eyes made me sick to my stomach. She didn't even flinch. She was a threat, Karen muttered under her breath, almost as if justifying her actions. A threat to everything this family stands for. Her words were like a slap to my face. My heart broke for Grace, who was now struggling to stay conscious, her small body trembling in my arms. The world around me seemed to fade away, and all I could hear was the sound of my own voice pleading with her, begging her to hold on. "Please, Grace, stay with me," I whispered, my tears falling on her face. I could feel the life draining from her, and I knew we didn't have much time, but I wasn't ready to lose her, not like this. Not because of someone else's hatred, not because of someone else's obsession with perfection. I glanced over at the guests in the room, some of them still frozen in shock, others beginning to move toward the exit, but no one seemed to know what to do. The police had already been called, but it felt like an eternity before they arrived. And as they rushed to take Karen into custody, my thoughts remained on one thing: Grace. Was she going to make it? Would we ever be able to move past this moment, this senseless act of violence that had turned our world upside down? As the police cuffed Karen, I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They were asking her questions, trying to understand what had driven her to such an extreme, but I knew there was no explanation. No words could justify what she had done. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. And as I held my daughter, praying that she would survive this, I realized one undeniable truth: this night would change everything. It wasn't just the wedding that had been ruined. It was our entire world. The aftermath of the shooting was nothing short of chaotic. The room was a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and frantic movements as people tried to make sense of what had just occurred. I couldn't focus on anything but Grace. The seconds felt like hours, and every beat of my heart seemed to echo louder in my ears as I watched the life drain from her face. I couldn't bear it. The world around me had become a haze, but all I could do was hold my daughter, praying that the blood wasn't going to be the last thing I'd see of her. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Officers rushed into the room, their presence bringing a sense of order to the madness, but nothing could calm the fear that gripped my heart. The chaos around us was overwhelming. Guests were crying. Some were still too shocked to move. Others were trying to comfort the bride and groom, whose joy had been stripped away in an instant. But for me, nothing mattered except Grace. She had been shot, and now it was a race against time to get her help before the damage became irreversible. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She had fallen silent, her body cold to the touch, and I could feel her pulse weakening in my hands. The medics quickly arrived and began working on her, but it all felt surreal. How could this be happening? How could someone so close to us, someone who had been in our lives for years, have done this? How could Karen, the woman who had always lived next door, had been involved in our community, be capable of this level of hatred? As Grace was rushed to the hospital, I was left with a sense of numb disbelief. The investigation had just begun, and the police were already questioning everyone in the room. I could barely hear them, too consumed by the fear of losing my daughter, but I knew the questions they were asking were important. What had happened in the moments before the shot rang out? Why had Karen shot Grace? I could hear the murmurs of the guests as they were interviewed one by one. Some people were still too stunned to speak coherently, others were recounting what they had seen, but it was clear that no one had expected something like this. The wedding had started out as a joyous occasion, but now it was the scene of a crime, one that no one could quite understand. Karen was arrested and taken away in handcuffs, but I couldn't help but feel a cold anger welling up inside me as I watched her being escorted out of the venue. She wasn't panicked. She didn't seem the least bit remorseful. In fact, she was eerily calm. I had expected her to at least show some guilt, some sign that she realized the magnitude of her actions, but no. She acted like this was a normal part of her day. I could see her muttering to the officers, her face hardened with defiance. Her words were sharp, almost dismissive, as if she had no concern for the life she had just destroyed. "This was necessary," Karen said coldly, her eyes never leaving me. She was a threat to everything I've worked for. She didn't belong here. Her wheelchair was ruining the wedding, ruining the image of perfection that we've all strived for. Her words hit me like a slap. How could she justify this? How could she possibly think that shooting my daughter, an innocent child, was necessary to maintain some twisted vision of perfection? It was beyond my understanding. The hatred in her voice, the utter lack of remorse, told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person Karen truly was. This wasn't just an impulsive act. It was the culmination of years of deep-seated animosity, of a belief that people like Grace, people with disabilities, were somehow less than others. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Karen had always been a controlling figure in the neighborhood, always trying to dictate how people should live, how they should act. But this was something far worse. She hadn't just judged us for being different. She had decided that Grace's very existence was a threat, and she had taken matters into her own hands. As I sat in the police station, my mind raced with questions, none of which had answers. Why had Karen acted this way? Was it just her obsession with control, or had there been something deeper? Some personal vendetta against Grace? What had driven her to such an extreme? The police had started their investigation, questioning witnesses and gathering evidence, but I knew the answers wouldn't come easily. The truth was far more complicated than a simple altercation. There were layers of hatred, control, and a deep-rooted desire for power that had led to this moment. In the days that followed, the media began to pick up the story. Headlines screamed about the shocking HOA shooting and mother fights for her daughter's life after brutal attack by neighbor. News stations were filled with interviews from shocked guests, each one recounting the horror of that night. But for me, all of that was secondary. The only thing that mattered was Grace's recovery. She was in critical condition, and the doctors couldn't give me any guarantees about her future. They said she was stable for now, but the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. As the investigation continued, we learned more about Karen's past. She wasn't just some angry woman who had snapped. She had a history of targeting people she considered undesirable. We uncovered instances where she had publicly shamed people with disabilities in the neighborhood, trying to push them out of her perfect world. The more we learned about her, the more I realized how deeply rooted her hatred had been. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of contempt, reflection of a society that had allowed her to thrive in her toxic mindset. Grace's shooting wasn't just about a personal vendetta, it was about the way people like Karen saw the world. A world where anything or anyone that didn't fit into their narrow, judgmental view of perfection had to be eliminated. And that's exactly what Karen had tried to do. She had tried to eliminate Grace, to make her disappear, because she couldn't stand the sight of someone who didn't conform to her ideals. The police continued to dig deeper, piecing together the events of that fateful night. It became clear that Karen had been planning her attack for some time. She had watched Grace, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and she had seized it. But the more we uncovered about Karen's motivations, the more I realized that this was bigger than just one woman's hatred. It was about the systems and attitudes that allowed people like Karen to feel justified in their cruelty. As I sat in the quiet of my home, waiting for updates on Grace's condition, I knew one thing for certain. This battle was far from over. It wasn't just about getting justice for Grace, it was about dismantling the mindset that allowed someone like Karen to thrive. And I would fight every step of the way to make sure that no one else would have to face what we had endured. As the days passed, the investigation into the shooting slowly unfolded, and with each passing moment, I found myself getting more and more tangled in the web of Karen's twisted motivations. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about how someone so close to our lives, someone who had been just a neighbor, could harbor so much hatred. It was clear now that the shooting wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It had been calculated, premeditated, and rooted in something far deeper than I had initially realized. Karen's behavior after the incident had been chillingly detached. As she was arrested and taken away, her lack of remorse was evident in every word she spoke. She seemed to believe that she had done something justified, that her actions were somehow in line with her sense of moral superiority. And that's when I realized it wasn't just about her discomfort with Grace's disability or her wheelchair. It was about control. Karen had always been obsessed with maintaining an image of perfection, of controlling every aspect of her life and the lives of those around her. To her, Anyone who didn't conform to her vision of normalcy was an enemy to be eradicated. The more the police uncovered about Karen's past, the more I understood the depth of her cruelty. Karen hadn't just been a neighbor who disliked people with disabilities, she had a long history of trying to force those she deemed unworthy out of her world. Over the years, Karen had made countless comments about people she thought didn't belong in the neighborhood, targeting families that didn't fit her idea of a perfect community. But it wasn't just her words that were harmful. Karen had used her power as the HOA president to push people out. She had lobbied against families with children who had special needs, families that didn't meet her standards. She had used her position to implement policies that would make it harder for these families to live comfortably in the neighborhood. Karen had made it clear that if you didn't fit into her version of perfection, you weren't welcome. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Karen had taken her obsession with perfection to dangerous extremes. She had a twisted vision of the world, one in which anyone who didn't fit her narrow view was a threat to the sanctity of her life. And Grace, simply by being who she was, had become the ultimate symbol of that threat. Grace wasn't just a disabled girl in a wheelchair to Karen. To Karen, Grace represented everything that she despised: imperfection, vulnerability, and fragility. Karen saw those qualities as weaknesses, things that she believed had no place in her world. And that's when I began to understand. Karen's hatred wasn't just about Grace, it was about a deeper issue within herself. Karen's need for control, her desire to dictate what was acceptable in her world, had consumed her to the point where she was willing to do anything to maintain that control. The sight of someone like Grace, someone who was unapologetically herself, had shaken Karen to her core. Grace's wheelchair wasn't just a physical aid. To Karen, it was a symbol of everything she feared. It was a reminder that not everyone could be perfect, and that was something Karen couldn't bear. As the police dug deeper, we learned that Karen had been monitoring Grace for months, watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to act. It wasn't just the wedding that had triggered her. It was the very fact that Grace existed in a way that Karen couldn't control. Grace's presence was a constant reminder to Karen that the world wasn't as perfect as she wanted it to be. And so, in her mind, she had to eliminate that threat. She had to remove the source of her discomfort, to rid her world of anything that didn't conform to her idea of what was right. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could anyone, let alone someone who had been part of our community, hold so much hate in their heart? Karen had spent years cultivating a perfect facade, a life that she believed was beyond reproach. But beneath that polished exterior was a deep well of resentment and insecurity. She had used her position of power to bully, to intimidate, and to control anyone who didn't fit her ideal. She had made Grace a target simply because Grace dared to exist in a way that Karen couldn't understand or accept. The truth was, Karen didn't see Grace as a person. She didn't see her as a daughter, a sister, or a friend. Karen saw Grace as a problem, an obstacle that needed to be removed in order for her perfect world to remain intact. And when Karen had the opportunity, she took the most drastic, unforgivable step imaginable. She shot my daughter. She did it not because Grace had done anything wrong, but because Grace's very existence was a threat to Karen's fragile sense of control. It wasn't just the wheelchair that bothered Karen. It was the idea that someone could be so comfortable in their own skin, so unapologetically themselves, despite the challenges life had thrown at them. Karen couldn't fathom how Grace could be happy, how Grace could find peace and joy in a world that often made her feel like an outsider. It was that inner peace, that sense of acceptance, that terrified Karen. It was something she could never understand, something she could never achieve. And so, she took it away from Grace in the most violent way possible. As the trial approached, I found myself grappling with a mixture of emotions. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief. There were so many feelings I couldn't fully process. How could someone so close to us, someone who had spent years living next door, someone I had once considered an ally, become capable of something so vile? And what did that say about the world we lived in? The more I learned about Karen's motivations, the more I realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of a much larger issue: the way society often marginalizes those who don't fit into narrow definitions of normalcy. It was about the fear of imperfection, the fear of vulnerability, and the lengths some people would go to in order to suppress those who dared to be different. But for me, it was also about something much more personal: my daughter, my sweet Grace, who had done nothing wrong, who had only ever wanted to live her life in peace. And now, she was paying the price for someone else's hatred. I would never stop fighting for her, for justice, and for a world where people like Karen could no longer impose their narrow-minded views on others. Grace's story wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about standing up against hatred, standing up for those who have been silenced, and fighting to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same cruelty. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of the past months. As the trial for Karen's actions began, I found myself grappling with so many emotions: fear, anger, sadness, but also a burning desire for justice. I couldn't imagine what the next few days would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: I had to be there for Grace. She had suffered enough, and it was time for Karen to face the consequences of her actions. The trial had been anticipated for weeks, and as we entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecutor had outlined the charges against Karen clearly: attempted murder, assault, and a variety of other criminal offenses. The evidence was damning. Witnesses had testified, and the medical reports clearly showed that Grace had been shot deliberately. There was no denying what had happened. Karen had pulled the trigger, and now she had to face the consequences. I watched Karen as she sat there in the defendant's chair. Her posture was stiff, her face expressionless. I couldn't help but feel disgust as I looked at her, remembering the night when she had so callously pointed that gun at my daughter. There was no remorse in her eyes, not an ounce of guilt. In fact, there was something almost chilling about her lack of emotion. It was as if she had no understanding of the gravity of what she had done. She wasn't just facing a court of law, she was facing the consequences of a lifetime of hatred, cruelty, and a misguided obsession with control. The prosecutor laid out the evidence one by one, each piece revealing the extent of Karen's actions, but it was her twisted justifications for the crime that made my blood boil. Karen had been asked repeatedly what had driven her to commit such an atrocious act, and her answers were cold, calculated, and filled with disdain. She was a threat, Karen had said, her voice unwavering. Her presence disrupted everything. She didn't belong here. The wheelchair, it represented everything I couldn't stand. It ruined the wedding, ruined the image I was trying to protect. She went on, saying that Grace's disability was a sign of weakness, a weakness that had no place in a world where perfection was the ultimate goal. The audacity, the cruelty, in her words, only made me more determined to fight. I couldn't let her justify what she had done. Karen had targeted my daughter because she couldn't stand the sight of someone who didn't conform to her vision of what the world should be. And that, to me, was unforgivable. As the trial went on, my thoughts kept drifting back to Grace. She had been through so much, and yet she had remained strong. Her recovery, both physical and emotional, had been a long, difficult journey, but she had made it. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, but the mental and emotional scars would take much longer to heal. Grace had struggled with fear, with anxiety, with anger. And who could blame her? The very person who had once been part of our lives, who had smiled at us and exchanged pleasantries, had turned on us with a cruelty I couldn't even comprehend. Grace had trusted Karen, had seen her as just another neighbor, another person in her life. And in one instant, that trust had been shattered forever. But Grace was strong, stronger than anyone realized. Throughout the trial, she had remained silent, but I knew she was listening, processing every word. I could see the pain in her eyes, the frustration, the disbelief, but there was something else too: determination. She wanted justice not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their disability. This was no longer just about her. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been bullied, ostracized, or rejected for being different. In the days that followed, as the final arguments were made, I knew that the outcome of this trial would not bring back the innocence Karen had stolen from us. It wouldn't undo the pain or the trauma Grace had suffered, but it would bring closure. It would show the world that people like Karen, who believed they could bully and destroy others in their quest for power, could not hide behind their positions any longer. They could not get away with their cruelty, no matter how perfect their world seemed on the outside. The day the verdict was delivered, I held my breath as the judge spoke. The courtroom fell silent as the words were spoken. Guilty. Karen was found guilty of all charges, including attempted murder, assault, and the use of a firearm in the commission of a crime. It was a victory, yes, but it didn't feel like one. Justice had been served, but it wasn't the kind of justice I had imagined. I had imagined Karen facing her punishment, her guilt written all over her face. Instead, she sat there, stone-faced, as though the verdict meant nothing to her. As the judge sentenced her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, but also a deep, aching sadness. Karen had tried to destroy our family, to break us with her hatred, but in the end, she had failed. My daughter was alive, and while the road to healing would be long, she was not broken. She had survived, and that was something Karen could never take away from her. Grace and I walked out of the courtroom together, side by side, stronger than before. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we had each other, and we had a new understanding of the world around us. A world that often tried to tear people down because they were different, but a world that was also filled with people like Grace, resilient, beautiful, and unapologetically themselves. Karen may have taken something from us that night, but she hadn't taken everything. We were still here, still fighting for what was right, and no amount of hatred could change that. As we left the courthouse, I looked at Grace and saw the strength in her eyes. We had won not because of the verdict, but because we had survived, and we would continue to survive together. This story is not just about the shooting, about Karen's actions. It's about standing up against hatred, against prejudice, and against the belief that anyone has the right to control another's life. It's about love, resilience, and the power of family. And it's a reminder that no matter what happens, we can always rise again. As the trial concluded, and we began to return to some semblance of normalcy, I realized that our journey was far from over. The experience we'd gone through, the trauma, the pain, the anger, wasn't something we could just forget. It would take time to heal, but more than that, it had awakened a new sense of purpose in me. This wasn't just a story of personal loss or revenge. It was a story of resilience, of standing up against the forces that seek to silence and destroy what they don't understand. But as the dust began to settle, I felt an undeniable urge to share this story with the world. Not just for us, but for everyone who has ever been marginalized, bullied, or hurt by the cruel actions of others. For every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of their differences, whether physical, mental, or emotional. Grace's story is not unique. It is the story of so many others who have had to endure hate simply for existing as they are. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we can't stay silent in the face of injustice. We can't allow people like Karen to walk through life unchecked, spreading their hate and judgment. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything that has happened, I want to ask you, the person reading or watching this, to think about your role in this fight. Yes, it's easy to think that the problem of hate and discrimination is something that only happens to others. But that's simply not true. Every single person has the ability to make a difference. Every single one of us has the power to stand up for those who can't defend themselves. Every act of kindness, every moment of compassion matters. If you are watching this and you've ever felt like an outsider, like someone who doesn't fit in, I want you to know that you are not alone. There are so many people out there who understand what you're going through, who have faced the same struggles, the same challenges, and we are here to fight alongside you. Grace's story is one of triumph in the face of adversity, but it's also a reminder that the fight isn't over. There are still people out there like Karen, people who believe they have the right to tear others down simply because they are different. But there are also millions of people who believe in love, in equality, in justice. And we are stronger when we stand together. So, I ask you to share this story. Share it with your friends, your family, your community. Share it because it's a story of survival, of courage, and of strength. But most importantly, share it because it's a story that needs to be heard. It's a reminder that the fight against hate and injustice is ongoing, and it's a fight we can all take part in. And I urge you to reflect on your own actions. Have you ever looked the other way when you saw someone being bullied or ostracized? Have you ever stayed silent when someone was being treated unfairly? It's easy to say, that's not my problem, but the truth is, it is all of our problems. Injustice affects us all, whether directly or indirectly. The more we stand up for what's right, the more we support one another, the closer we get to creating a world where love and acceptance are the standards, not hatred and exclusion. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of hate, let Grace's story be a reminder that you have the strength to make a difference. You don't have to be a victim of your circumstances. You can fight back, not with violence or hate, but with kindness, with understanding, and with courage. The world needs more people like you, people who refuse to accept the status quo, people who believe in the power of compassion and community. I also want to encourage you to support organizations that are dedicated to fighting discrimination and supporting those who are marginalized. Whether it's organizations that work with people with disabilities, racial justice groups, or others that stand up for human rights, they need our support. They need our voices. And most importantly, they need our actions. Together, we can change the narrative. We can create a world where people like Grace, people who are different, are not seen as threats, but as valuable, as beautiful, as worthy of love and respect. We can create a world where no one ever has to fear being attacked for simply existing. It's not an easy road, and it won't happen overnight, but it starts with all of us. It starts with refusing to remain silent, refusing to let hate go unchallenged, and choosing to stand up for what's right. As you watch this, ask yourself, what can I do to make the world a better place? How can I help create a society where everyone is valued for who they are? The answers might not be easy, but every small step counts. Every act of kindness, every time you choose to stand up for someone, every moment you choose compassion over judgment makes a difference. Please share Grace's story. Spread the word. Let it serve as a reminder that we are all responsible for creating a world where love conquers hate. Let it inspire you to act, to speak out, and to stand tall in the face of adversity. Together, we can make the world a better place for all of us. And remember, no matter what challenges you face, no matter how difficult the road may seem, you are not alone. We are all in this together, and together we are unstoppable. And if you're new to our community, or if you've just heard Grace's story for the first time, I ask you to subscribe, to follow, and to stay engaged with us. Because the fight for justice, for acceptance, for love, it's ongoing, and we need you. We need your voice. Join us as we continue to challenge hate, to support one another, and to build a future where no one is left behind. Thank you for standing with us. Let's keep moving forward together.